The heat was unbelievable. Ethan drove in the car, squinting at the pleasant, cooling breeze from the air conditioner. Years ago, the man could not even imagine that he would have such an expensive car and that his name would be known in business circles. A smile appeared on Ethan's lips, and the man looked at his driver, remembering that at one time he had started from the same position. He used to work as a forklift driver, and then he managed to get a job as a director's driver. At that time, that job seemed to Ethan the dream limit. And then he suddenly found his old diary in his belongings, in which he had been writing down his plans and goals as a teenager. When he opened the diary and read about his childish dreams and plans, Ethan realized that he had never come close to any of his goals. It was as if he had lost faith in himself when he grew up and stopped at what he had achieved. This became a kind of kick for Ethan. He started working hard, saving every penny for his endeavor. When he quit his job and sold his small apartment, his girlfriend left him, saying that she would never build a future with such a loser. Ethan was offended because the woman he loved with all his heart did not believe in him. However, he still moved on from that loss, and now he has achieved all the heights of which he had dreamed before. Subsequently, the girl tried to return to him, but he was well aware that she was only interested in money. Ethan put the memories of his past life aside as soon as he reached his new office. As he got out of the car, he wrinkled a little from the sunlight and put on his sunglasses. Perhaps the man was trying to hide from the journalists even more than from the scorching rays. There were going to be many journalists today because Ethan was opening another branch of his real estate agency. Of course, he would have to give an interview, but Ethan planned that it would happen a little later, because first he had to make sure that everything was in order and was going strictly according to plan. When he approached the building, he looked with satisfaction at the festive balloon arch and beautiful signboard, and then entered the building. Employees smartly dressed and with sincere smiles on their faces immediately began to tell what they had already done. Ethan praised all of his subordinates. "It wouldn't all have been possible without you," said one of the employees suddenly, who had been working for a long time and was happy to be promoted to the new branch as a head. Ethan didn't argue, and he was pleased that people appreciated him as a boss. After making sure that the buffet and treats were ready, Ethan smiled. He looked at the baskets with sweets and fruits and imagined how happy the children would be when they came with their parents. Everyone knew that Ethan would take care of the children's program to please the little ones. Soon, music began to play outside and the celebration began. Ethan looked outside and saw the first guests had already begun to gather under the tent. Soon the presenter came on the stage and started the festive program, and after him appeared a dancer. Ethan went outside too, because soon he had to make a speech. Suddenly, someone yanked the man by the elbow, and he heard a gruff voice and turned around. "Son, I'm ashamed to ask for alms here, but please give me something to buy food." Ethan looked at the poorly dressed old woman standing behind him. She was short, thin, gray-haired. She reminded him of a grief-stricken and unbearable woman from a war movie. "Of course," replied Ethan, and reached in his pocket for some money. He pulled out some large bills and held them out for the elderly woman, but when she took the money and began to thank him, Ethan became dazed, his gaze fixed on the woman's earrings. The stones, already faded, brought him back for a moment to a distant past. "Where did you get those earrings?" Ethan asked in a worried voice. The woman turned sharply, pale, and began to look frightened at the man standing in front of her. It was as if she was frightened by the question. "Sorry, I am not going to sell them," she shook her head. Apparently, she had been offered more than once to sell the earrings, since she was so terrified of the question. "I'm not asking you to sell them to me, I just asked where you got them," answered Ethan. "My late husband, heaven rest his soul, He made them himself in his time, because back then it was very difficult to get a piece of jewelry. They're expensive, dear to me as a memory. That's why I don't want to sell them. Even if I die of hunger, I won't sell them. I'm not asking for money for myself, but my granddaughter is bedridden and she suffers. She's trying, doing everything to get back on her feet. Ethan grew cold with the flood of memories. He remembered the hardest times of his life, and kind Mrs. Jones, who had helped him and his mother then, but was standing in front of him now, asking for alms. Ethan was born in an economic crisis. Factories were closing, and many people were lost without work. Although Ethan was a little boy, he remembered perfectly well how his father came home drunk and told them to get out of the house, because he was not going to take care of them anymore. The mother took little Ethan by his hand and went away tearfully. She knew that if she would stay, the husband would beat her, as he had done before. After spending the night on a park bench and feeding the boy an apple from a tree growing there, the woman did not know where to go, and then she met Mrs. Jones. The kind-hearted woman fed the hungry mother and son and gave them shelter in her small flat with 2 rooms. Mrs. Jones helped Ethan's mother get a job, and she was able to get back on her feet thanks to her. There she also met a wonderful man who later became Ethan's stepfather. The connection with Mrs. Jones was severed when they went to live with Ethan's stepfather, and Mrs. Jones sold her house and left for an unknown destination. Ethan often remembers Mrs. Jones, her invaluable help, and her words that always supported him and helped him move on. Mrs. Jones shook her head that she could not believe that this was possible, that after all these years, she had met the very boy who had helped her take care of her newborn granddaughter because her daughter had died during childbirth. Suddenly, journalists began to surround Ethan, asking him questions, and at one point, Mrs. Jones disappeared into the crowd. Ethan tried to find her with his eyes, but all in vain. The man became angry that he had been distracted from an important conversation. He offered to ask questions to the agency staff and left for the main office, where he immediately called his mother and told her about his unexpected meeting. Of course, his mother remembered Mrs. Jones. "Son, we must find her and help her by all means. She had helped us so much. Apparently God himself has bumped you two together so that we could thank her for her kindness." Ethan thought the same thing, so he began to look hard for the woman to help her and her granddaughter get back on her feet. He remembered this little baby girl who used to look at him with her big bright eyes and often whimpered. At that time, Ethan was annoyed by the baby's crying, but it remained forever in his heart as a pleasant memory. The search progressed slowly, and only a week later, his people called and said that they managed to find Mrs. Jones. She lived in a small village about half an hour from the city, and she lived very poor. The house was very dilapidated. Ethan's heart was bleeding. He put everything aside and went to the address that was sent to him in the message. The man wasn't afraid that Mrs. Jones would not want to accept his help, because she wouldn't run away for no reason at the opening of the affiliate. However, as soon as he drove up to the house, Mrs. Jones came out onto the porch and began to cry when she recognized Ethan. "I never thought, dear boy, that you would decide to find me and come. I'm sorry, I don't have anything to treat you with. There's not even any coffee left. I used your money to buy flour, cereal, noodles, and medicine for Dominica. She has become weak. She is trying to get up, but it is very painful," said the old woman, and cried again. "Why did you run away then? I wanted to help you." "I don't know," said Mrs. Jones, with a shrug of her shoulders. "I'm used to putting everything on my back. No one has ever offered to help me. I was afraid." Ethan nodded, understanding, and asked what happened to Dominica. The elderly woman looked at Ethan with pursed lips. Her eyes filled with tears and her chin began to shake. She sat down on the porch and wrapped her arms around her head. "I'll tell you, son. Though I know there is no justice in this world, and I can't get it, because I was trying both in police and in court." And Mrs. Jones told the terrible events that had happened in their lives 3 years ago. Dominica was returning home as usual. She had managed to leave work an hour earlier because of her grandmother's birthday. It was a warm September evening and the streets were crowded. Dominica was followed by the local policeman's son, Paul, who had been paying attention to her for a long time. But she disliked him, but she didn't like him at all. He was married, and he didn't want to hear Dominica's refusal. That day, he was a little drunk, and walking beside her, he began to insist on attention. He followed Dominica into the underground passage. She was very frightened, but she tried not to show it, calmly spoke to the man and explained to him why there could be nothing between them. And then he jumped on her and started tearing her clothes off. Somehow she managed to pull away from him. She almost ran onto the street, but he caught up with her and pushed her down the stairs. My granddaughter was in intensive care for several weeks. We tried to accuse Paul, but he denied everything, and thanks to his father's connections, he remained innocent, and we did not receive any compensation. Dominica needed an urgent and expensive spinal surgery. That's when I bought this house for next to nothing and sold my condo in town. Then there was an operation. The doctors assured me that everything went well, but Dominica had no progress. I went to another doctor, and after the tests, he said that the first operation had not been done correctly and that another one was needed. I went to the hospital with this report, but I could not prove anything, and they accused me of trying to get a secondary surgery for free. Mrs. Jones sighed heavily. So my granddaughter and I were left in this hovel, which each year is crumbling more and more. And I don't know what to do next. Dominica began to pay a disability allowance, but it is not enough. Together with my pension, we only have enough for medicine and the most basic food. I have to ask for alms. It's hard every time to approach a person with an outstretched hand. But for my granddaughter's sake, I'm ready for anything. After all, she and I are the only ones in this whole world, and so it turned out that she lies in the bed, tries to get up, screams in pain, falls down, and cries because of her helplessness, and then she tries to get up again. But it is harmful because her spine is already too weak. Ethan listened to Mrs. Jones' story in silence, and he decided that he would definitely get justice. He would make the policeman's son pay for his atrocity, and he would find a solution for the hospital. If they had made a mistake, they should have corrected it. Don't worry, Mrs. Jones. Now you have me and I will help you. You had helped us. Now it's my turn to return the favor. Thank you, son. I will be indebted to you for the rest of my life. I don't have much time left, but I was always very worried about how Dominica would be without me. Ethan entered the house to see Dominica, and it was painful for him to look at her. Many years ago, she had looked at him with the same big green eyes, but she was lying in a cradle, and now she was lying in an adult bed. Mrs. Jones told her granddaughter everything from the beginning, how she had met little Ethan and his mother, and how she had met him now. It was painful for the young woman to hear that her grandmother had to beg for alms. Upon returning home, Ethan immediately called all of his influential acquaintances and asked them to look into the case of Dominica and her attacker, who was still at large. Ethan could not stand people like that, and he desperately wanted justice to be done. He also called his good acquaintance, a surgeon, whom his agency had recently found a house to buy. He asked him what was necessary to do for Dominica's surgery. The next day, the young woman was taken to the hospital for a consultation. Mrs. Jones thanked Ethan unceasingly, crying and saying that she would never have made it without him. Ethan's lawyers also filed a lawsuit in court. Only then the hospital began internal proceedings in an attempt to find who was responsible for the failed surgery. Paul was caught in a dark alley and was given a good lesson. He was intimidated so much that he was compelled to run to the police with a confession. Soon, he was sent to prison. Ethan bought a comfortable house for Mrs. Jones, and his mother came and helped the woman move in while her granddaughter was in the hospital. Dominica had a successful surgery. She did her best to follow the doctor's recommendations. A year later, Dominica began to take steady steps and could go without rest for a long time. Ethan became a frequent guest at Mrs. Jones' house, and unnoticingly, he began to feel warm feelings towards Dominica. She charmed the man, and he dared to ask her on a date. Dominica had nothing against it because she liked Ethan as a man, and he had a huge, kind heart. He was the man she had dreamed of and had been waiting for years.